Hola, mundo. Ahorita vas a ver una entrevista muy importante. Ojalá con todo mi corazón que veas toda la entrevista. En el video de hoy hablamos del tema de la preparación para la concepción. Es un concepto fundamental para la humanidad. Es un arte, una ciencia, una práctica milenaria que hemos perdido en los tiempos modernos. Nuestros ancestros sabían que hay que preparar cuerpo de mamá y también de papá antes de concebir, igual que ponemos bien bonito el suelo con compost y todo antes de echar semillas en el huerto. Es el mismo con nuestros cuerpos, ¿no? Con nuestra tierra que va a recibir la semilla, que va a recibir otra vida. Entonces, te pido mucho que mires toda la entrevista con Lily Nichols. Si te interesa más este tema, te cuento. Yo soy apasionada del tema desde hace mucho tiempo porque leí un libro que se llama Nutrition and Physical Degeneration, Nutrición y Degeneración Física. Ese libro y el doctor que lo escribió es la razón por la cual empecé este proyecto. Entonces, voy a poner debajo de este video un enlace para que veas una charla que hice hace años justamente sobre el libro que, que motivó este canal y este proyecto que tengo. Y también te quiero contar que estoy guiando un curso para mujeres y para parejas de preparación para la concepción. También es para personas que no necesariamente quieren concebir, pero que quieren optimizar su salud hormonal, porque tu salud, o sea, tu fertilidad, tu salud reproductiva es un pilar de tu salud en general, incluso si no quieres tener un bebé, ¿no? Entonces, estoy en un curso de preparación para la concepción. Ahorita estamos terminando el 5.º mes, entrando en el 6.º mes, son 6 meses en total. Ha sido una experiencia maravillosa y en pocos meses voy a abrir otro grupo, o sea, voy a hacer todo el programa con otro grupo. Entonces, también debajo de este video pongo un enlace para que te puedas suscribir y recibir información del programa cuando se abre para el segundo grupo. Entonces, disfruta mucho este video. Lily Nichols, la mujer que estoy entrevistando, es una mujer increíble. Me encantaría algún día tener sus libros escritos o traducidos en español. Y de hecho, ahorita estoy estudiando con ella. Fui elegida para estudiar en su Instituto de Nutrición Prenatal para ser especialista en nutrición prenatal. Estoy en ese camino. Entonces, es maravilloso para mí tener la oportunidad de entrevistarla y compartir esta entrevista traducida con el mundo hispanohablante. Entonces, disfruta mucho y luego puedes ver así con calma los enlaces debajo de este video y nos vemos pronto. Bye.
Hello and welcome to Yo Soy Pachamamista. Today we have Lily Nichols as a guest. Lily, I am very excited and grateful for your time and your presence because today we're going to be talking about nutrition, focusing on preconception nutrition and pregnancy nutrition and postpartum nutrition, this like delicate, important span of time for mothers and babies and really for all of humanity because mama's bodies are nurturing our future. And so I'm so grateful for your work. And before we get started with questions, I wanted to give you a chance to talk a little bit about yourself and how you came to focus on nutrition and real food nutrition. You know, it's very different than mainstream dietitian kind of knowledge. And then how you came to focus specifically on pregnancy and preconception nutrition as well.
Yeah, so I'll give you a hopefully brief overview. I've had a lifelong interest in nutrition. It was, an area that I decided I probably wanted to specialize in when I was in high school, actually. And I was thankfully introduced to some, ancestral eating styles, Weston Price's research before I even went to school. So by the time I was in school, which was a conventional dietetics preparation kind of program, getting my bachelor's in nutrition, I wasn't just taking everything in the textbooks at face value, because my lived experience as a, former vegetarian was that I felt significantly better when I started eating more whole foods, embracing more fat, embracing more protein, especially animal protein in my diet. And so I didn't take everything as truth. It was more so like I had an understanding even at that time that like, okay, like these are based on some guidelines that might not be super accurate. And there's vested interests in pushing forward these different, narratives. So by the time I completed my training, completed my internship, got my RD, I had an opportunity come up to work in the prenatal space, specifically working with women with gestational diabetes, and working with the California Diabetes and Pregnancy Program. And I took it and ran with it. And it was in that setting that I was able to see firsthand how important it is for nutrition to be pretty dialed in during pregnancy, because it does actually influence the development of the baby. So with gestational diabetes, for example, we know there's at minimum like a 6-fold higher risk of a child developing type 2 diabetes or obesity in their lifetime if the mother's blood sugar wasn't well controlled during pregnancy. But we can take that down to basically baseline levels, no higher risk, regardless of an official diagnosis, if we get blood sugar in a healthy range. And to take it a step further, it was a little bit disheartening that when I recommended people follow the guidelines for gestational diabetes, their blood sugar levels often got worse. At the very least, they didn't improve, but oftentimes they got worse, necessitating insulin and medication, and essentially starting the cascade of interventions that we see around birth, starting like all the way in pregnancy, over-medicalizing their pregnancy, over-medicalizing their birth. And we could greatly improve outcomes if we just improved the nutrition advice we were giving them. So that was the springboard that got me hooked into focusing on prenatal nutrition. Many people now know my work for being really research focused and critical of dietary guidelines, like where they came from, the quality of the evidence used to set them, what new information we have that maybe questions those guidelines. So, I have 3 books now. I have Real Food for Gestational Diabetes, my first one, Real Food for Pregnancy, and my most recent book, Real Food for Fertility, that's really highlighting the importance of, yay, there it is, nutrient dense, real foods, whole foods that haven't been processed in a way that reduces their nutritional value for improving our overall health, and improving our ability to conceive, carry a healthy pregnancy, optimize the development of our baby, and then recover well postpartum, because, we need to do that part too. We can't leave out postpartum out of the equation.
Yeah, you know what is so interesting? Now in the collective consciousness, there is, of course, this like generally accepted idea that of course we want to eat healthy during pregnancy, or some people are focused on what supplements to take, which is another topic we can get into. But yeah, so pregnancy, people are like, of course you want to eat healthy. But this idea of preconception nutrition, even though some people like yourself and the Weston A Price Foundation have been talking about that for a while, that for so many people, that is still such a novel concept. Of course, it's not novel, like our ancestors did that. But I've talked to so many people about that, and they're like, whoa, like I've never thought about that. And then when I think, oh yeah, it's kind of like if you have a garden, you're going to tend to the soil before you put seeds there. It makes a little bit more sense. But I almost feel like it is even more important now than ever before that we focus on preconception nutrition, because we are several generations degenerated. Like, what Dr. Price was talking about even 100 years ago. And
Yeah,
it seems like if we're really talking about the health of humanity, we can not leave out preconception nutrition.
absolutely. Yeah. And I think you see that especially with pregnancy complications like gestational diabetes, preeclampsia, and some of these other situations. I mean, ultimately, a lot of times their origins go all the way back to the preconception window because it's often a reflection of egg and sperm quality, of how well the placenta developed and like attached to the uterine wall, which is a reflection of the health of your menstrual cycle. I mean, it goes deep. So yeah, preconception nutrition is absolutely vital, especially if we're going to have any hope at interrupting that intergenerational effect. I mean, if you look at, like I existed in my grandmother's womb inside my mother's ovaries, that alone is going back 3 generations. But some of the studies we have on animals, like the effects of, toxin exposure, undernutrition, or any of these things, that can go back like 7 generations. So we do need to be prioritizing this, I think, now more than ever. And especially in the months, but I would argue years leading up to conception, if we can optimize both partners' health, we can, improve their chances of conceiving whatsoever. I mean, infertility is now affecting 1 in 6 to 1 in 7 couples worldwide. We can reduce the chances of a pregnancy loss, like an early miscarriage, that does often go back to egg and sperm quality. We can improve the development of the placenta, which improves nutrient delivery to the baby, and also reduces the risk of a number of complications, because like preeclampsia, for example, does often stem back to an issue with the development of the placenta, which is happening very early in pregnancy. And a significant amount of the genes that are expressed in the placenta are actually of paternal origin. So it's not everything is mom's fault, as it always is blamed. There's a paternal component to these things as well. So yeah, I think it's huge. It's under discussed. From the angle of conventional healthcare, and I've worked in conventional healthcare before, there's always long been this challenge of how do you reach a wider audience of people in the preconception time. Like once a woman is pregnant, she does often seek some sort of care of some kind, but how do we handle that beforehand or the in-between pregnancies, the interpregnancy time? That is a challenge to reach people in a wider population. So I think currently the people who are seeking that information on preconception care are usually those who are already kind of health conscious. So we're kind of optimizing the people who are already at a pretty decent place, but there's a significant portion of the population that doesn't have it doesn't really have this on their mind. And then you couple that with, 50% of pregnancies approximately are unplanned. We need to be thinking about this from a whole body, whole life health standpoint versus, oh, we just need to do these specific things to get you pregnant. We need to think about supporting our health lifelong, just in case there's a surprise pregnancy in there.
Right. I mean, it goes back so far. It's it goes back so far. I mean, Oh my goodness. It even as a young woman, like teaching young women what it means to have a menstrual cycle, how to support themselves, how to rest, how to eat, teaching young teenage girls how to do that so that by the time they are going to get pregnant, they are well nourished. I mean, there's just such big work for humanity to
Yeah.
be doing right now. It's such a
Yeah,
big.
I agree.
So I heard Dr. Natasha Campbell McBride say once that if mom and dad are both healthy, meaning like there's no specific, no specific ailment that is bothering either of them, that 6 months would be a minimum amount of preconception care or really focused preconception preparation and nutrition. Is that like a good kind of roundabout number? Or I know it probably depends on each case, but what do
I
you
think
think
it
about?
depends on each case. I mean, if you're in pretty good health, if we're looking back at the time it takes for sperm to develop, which is a little more than 70 days, I mean, that's in a 3-month window. For egg quality, it goes back a little bit further. It depends on like how you're defining things, because if you're going all the way back to when an underdeveloped follicle is recruited from the ovary to be like nourished and developed into a full mature ovum that's ovulated and ready to be fertilized, that goes back 220 days. So that would be more in line with the 6 months or arguably up to like 8 months. Of course, that like 3-month window before ovulation is the time when like there's more direct effects from the nutrient intake and toxin exposure and those things that are happening during that window. So assuming general good health, I would say, 3 to 6 months. In an ideal world, everybody's already eating this way. So you almost don't even need to do anything extra special during that time. You're already well nourished. And then I'd say for individuals who have some underlying health challenges, maybe there's some insulin resistance or polycystic ovarian syndrome. Maybe there's digestive issues, thyroid issues, pretty high like toxic burden, any issues with male fertility, like low sperm quality. If somebody's been on hormonal contraceptives, especially for a long period of time, that does deplete a number of nutrient stores. And as well, it takes a long time for the menstrual cycle to return. It does affect your ovaries, and it depends on the case, but like on average, it can be 6 months to a year, sometimes until the cycle fully normalizes. In some cases, it's 18 months or more. So you might want to be focusing on a longer lead up time to pregnancy if you fall into any of those categories. And I mean, I don't know about you, but I feel like the average person I'm speaking to these days has a whole host of health issues, right? So erring on the longer side, of course, is ideal. At the same time, I don't want people to have an unnecessary level of stress over, oh no, I like don't have enough time. I really want to get pregnant soon. And I can't wait another year or something. Like every step that you take every day, every quality choice that you're making for your health and lifestyle adds up. So, and I'm not here to tell anybody what timeline is right for you or not. I would just say like the greater number and severity of health issues or factors that are kind of stacked against your nutrient status or menstrual cycle health, like hormone balance, fertility, the greater the amount of time in an ideal world we give ourselves.
So, yeah, that definitely makes sense. I I wonder what your thoughts are because, like you said, I think 50% of pregnancies are unplanned. So maybe the woman is already 6 or 7 or 8 weeks along before she realizes that she has a baby. And specifically with some nutrients, I've heard like, oh, that's a bummer because it's that first 7 or 8 weeks of life that are like crucial. For example, for folate, if you're deficient in folate, I heard a doctor say after 7 weeks, it's too late, which I understand we need folate throughout the pregnancy and postpartum, et cetera. But I'm just wondering, like, what are the nutrients that if we don't get them in the first 7 weeks of pregnancy that might cause issues? Are there specific nutrients like the conversation around folate or vitamin A, or I don't know. I don't know what your thoughts are.
There are. So different nutrients are important for different reasons at different stages in pregnancy. And we actually, just to throw this out there, we have less data on this than people claim, okay? If people are trying to say like, oh, you only need this nutrient during this phase, or you need increased amounts of this during this phase versus that phase, or trimester-specific meal plans or trimester-specific supplement strategies, there's really not enough data to like back any of those. But what I can say is the reason people might say, oh, it's too late at different stages, is when we look at the very early development in pregnancy, the period of embryogenesis, which is the first 8 weeks approximately, that's when it's called this instead of fetal development, because this is the time period when cells are still differentiating and being told like, okay, you are going to be part of the brain, you're going to be part of the spinal cord, you are going to be part of the heart, you are going to be part of the kidneys. Like, organs are still forming, organ systems are still forming, cells are still differentiating and being determined at what they're going to be in the body and where they're going to go. And that period of time is arguably the most sensitive to low nutrient intakes, or the consequences of low nutrient intakes during this time are most dire. So the folate conversation centers around neural tube defects. So the neural tube closes, I believe it's approximately day 21 after conception. So that's in the first, 5 to 6 weeks or so. Based on the way pregnancies are dated, it's like, they're based on your last menstrual period. So you have to like adjust your timelines. It's not after conception, it's after your last menstrual period. But anyways, that neural tube is closing for some women before they even know they're pregnant, which is why we've had a population-wide focus on folate for so long. That, however, is not the only nutrient involved in the closure of the neural tube. We don't even know the mechanism by which it works, and it doesn't always work. You can give women, particularly if you're focusing on like synthetic folic acid, 30% of neural tube defects are what's called folic acid resistant. So even though the mom had enough folic acid intake, there's still a neural tube defect. So what happened there? It's not folate alone that helps. Synthetic folic acid is a separate side conversation that we can have, but there's a number of nutrients involved in the many processes in closing the neural tube. A lot of them are nutrients involved in methylation. So choline, glycine, vitamin B12, vitamin B6, zinc, riboflavin. Those are some of the top ones that come to mind. I think there's others. There's a couple other amino acids as well. Those are the ones, did I say choline? Hopefully I said choline. Those are the ones most heavily involved in the closure of the neural tube. There's also toxin exposure that can increase the risk of neural tube defects. So that's somehow interfering with those pathways. Mercury is one example of something that can interfere with that. There's also nutrients involved in just many of the different organ formations, like retinol, vitamin A in its active form. We've long had this huge focus on avoiding preformed vitamin A as retinol because of some old studies in the early 1990s saying that it can increase the risk of certain birth defects when supplemented in the synthetic form. And this is true. However, the rates of birth defects caused by so-called vitamin A excess is very, very low. There's been approximately 20 documented in the last 30 years. But we have a wide range and an increasing number of birth defects from vitamin A deficiency, actually. So if you look at congenital diaphragmatic hernia, where the diaphragm doesn't form properly, meaning there's a hole between your abdominal cavity and your chest cavity, you start having your abdominal organs and digestive system start developing where the lungs should be. It's very serious. It could be life-threatening in many scenarios. But you look at the last 30 years, there's been over 1 million cases of that, right? Very, very, very strongly correlated to retinol deficiency by a number of different study types, not just animal studies. We have a lot of human data too. We have actually mechanistic data showing how those things occur in the situation of vitamin A deficiency. So I would definitely add retinol to the list of things you want to, it's a Goldilocks nutrient. You don't want people to have like massive quantities of it. It is fat soluble. It is something that you store in your body. But currently in the US, we're in the situation where 80% of women are not even meeting the very conservative, very low RDA for retinol. And many of them are deficient, overtly deficient. So we do need some emphasis on getting enough retinol, not taking a ton, not taking super high dose supplements, but encouraging enough retinol from whole food sources. So we avoid that situation as well. So yes, like it depends. There's nutrients where, you know, we do want to be really thinking about them in those early weeks. I do want to throw out one other little caveat, which is that, you know, I'm speaking specifically about like structural birth defects that occur early in pregnancy. Like there's still a role for these nutrients later in pregnancy. And these birth defects still are relatively rare. Okay. And so if you haven't done these things and you're currently pregnant and listening to this and you're like, oh my gosh, you know, is it too late for me to benefit from improving my diet quality because I've already missed that early, you know, 8-week window? Yes, there is, for different reasons than the mechanisms I just described. But yes, it's always still beneficial wherever you're at to focus on improving the quality of your diet. So try not to take this information and turn it into this like ball of stress. Oh, if only I had known. Believe me, there's plenty of things where I'm like, oh, if only I had known this research on choline, I would have done X, Y, Z, but it didn't exist when I was pregnant with my first, right? So we're always doing the best we can with the information we have at the time.
Mm-hmm. So there's so many ways that I could take this. I have so many questions, but let me go down this route. Is to supplement or not to supplement? Because here is the situation. I have an audience in Latin America that has very different economic levels. And there are, I think, a lot of people around the world, but I'm specifically talking about in Latin America, that are possibly not eating as much meat or having access to as much nutrient-dense food as, like, for example, the Weston A Price Foundation might recommend. And those people are usually asked to take vitamins, but the vitamins are not high quality. So it'll be a vitamin that's definitely got folic acid instead of folate. And so it's tricky, right? Because all the time people are asking, well, you know, should I take a supplement or should I not? And even people that have an economic capacity to buy expensive vitamins might not have access to them because they have to be shipped from the US. They could get stuck in customs. Like, I talked to a practitioner who was absolutely convinced that everybody should take Rosita cod liver oil. And I said, well, I can't really tell my audience that they have to take that no matter what, because it's not really an economic or a logistic reality to get that down there.
Yeah.
So it's a really kind of tricky thing about supplements. And then I think, wow, who am I, or who is anybody to say, well, no, don't take folic acid if that's the only thing you have available.
Right.
You know, it's such a important conversation. What are your thoughts about all of
Yeah,
it?
and I've worked with a lot of my early work was in Los Angeles with serving the underserved. So a lot of people in economic financial situations where they're I'm not recommending a fancy prenatal. They're getting whatever one a day the clinic gives out, which is imperfect. So I think we have to be really realistic about what information is appropriate to provide to our audience, depending on who they are. And that's really tricky for me as an author. And it actually holds a lot of practitioners back from putting some of their recommendations in writing, because when you're working one-on-one with somebody, you can assess where they're at and make the best choice for them, even if it's not like the best choice for every single person. You're leveling up, like just one step up from what's there. You're optimizing what's available. So what I would say is, I would say it's probably beneficial to just take whatever one is available to you, like the folic acid conversation. I have this super lengthy article on my website, freely available if anyone wants to look it up, on folate versus folic acid. The body does have the capacity to process some folic acid. It maxes out at about 200 to 280 micrograms per day, but nonetheless, we have the ability to process some of it. We can optimize our body's ability to process whatever synthetic folic acid we're taking in by having enough of all these other nutritional cofactors that help your body use it. So like your riboflavin, your B12, your B6, your glycine, your zinc. So if we can, choline is another one. So if we can make sure that people are getting enough of those nutrients, and I'd say that's focusing on whole unprocessed foods, whatever they have available, and then whatever's in their supplement, they'll better be able to utilize. My preference for individuals who are in a situation where supplements are unaffordable is that they put their money and resources into food. And I would say if you can emphasize the most nutrient-dense foods you have available, and those are not necessarily always really expensive, by the way, then you'll be in a better spot. So like the Rosita cod liver oil conversation, there's a couple nutrients we're thinking about with something like cod liver oil. You have not only the DHA, the omega-3s, but you have vitamin A and vitamin D, a little bit of K2. You can, for the DHA component, maybe they live in a community where you can catch fish. That would be a source of DHA. Maybe the chickens are free range in the area and the eggs would have a little bit of DHA. Maybe the beef is grass-fed, that would have a little bit of DHA. Maybe the local store has some canned seafood. Is canned seafood like ideal? Is it better than fresh? No, but it's available. It's shelf stable. It's not going to spoil. And for many places, I don't know about everywhere, it's much more affordable than fresh. And so maybe they have access to canned sardines, canned oysters, canned salmon, even canned tuna. I know people get weird about tuna because it could be higher in mercury. You don't absorb the majority of the mercury in there, and it's very high in DHA. So I would say that, the benefits of the DHA probably outweigh the risks of it being imperfect in the can, having a little bit of mercury in it, right? Organ meats, highly, highly nutrient dense, oftentimes available almost everywhere. You may have to go direct to the farm. But if you're in an area where they are harvesting and processing animals, there are likely organ meats available, and they're likely less expensive than muscle meats. So including those in your diet once or twice a week goes a very long way towards like fortifying your intake of nutrients. What is local and inexpensive to you? Like, definitely pay attention to what is available in your immediate area. I was recently traveling, and like the food quality, the foods that were available was really, really, really limited to whatever was shipped in, minus some like local fruit. So what did we do? We got local eggs too. We did local fruit. We did local eggs. We did the imperfect, I have no idea what quality meat that was at the grocery store. We did the, beans at the grocery store. We did, we made use of whatever vegetables we happened to have, which was not many. We made the best of it, And so a lot of times we are just responding to what's in our individual environment, but prioritizing what's nutrient dense. I would definitely prioritize your protein rich and animal foods, and then whatever produce or like bulk kind of staple items are available and least processed. Go with that first and spend your money there versus spending hundreds of dollars on supplements that are going to get tied up in customs and may never even get to you. Like that's a real issue in lots of parts of the world.
Yes, it is definitely, for sure. And then also kind of the danger of supplementation, even like if you have a very good brand and it's expensive and you think it's great, is sometimes that we can have the idea that we're covered. We can have a diet that's not great because we're taking this supplement. I have a loved one right now who's pregnant, and she has a little bit of that mentality, like, oh, I can, kind of do what I want because I'm taking this really fancy supplement, and so that's going to cover my bases.
Yeah. And I but it's like, I think of supplementation as an insurance policy. I mean, if you really start getting, like, if we're talking about the opposite extreme of the person with access and resources to those high quality supplements, I mean, to get a prenatal that's more or less comprehensive, you're looking at like 8 capsules a day, and it still doesn't have everything you need. Like, it doesn't, because we should be getting the majority of nutrition from our food. If you want to rewind the clock, I mean, you go back even less than 100 years, like vitamin B12 supplements didn't even exist. Folate hadn't even been identified yet. I mean, we didn't have the option, the privilege to rely on supplementation. It was what was in our food, what was in our diet. Certainly you can argue back then that the food was, more nutrient dense than it is today because, industrial farming wasn't as widespread, and we hadn't hybridized so many of the seeds to be, optimal for transit versus optimal for nutrient density or flavor. But nonetheless, like, we didn't even have the option to go for supplementation. So when you look at like what cultures did before we were in this globalized environment with, isolated supplements, we emphasize nutrient dense foods during preconception, during pregnancy, and postpartum for recovery. And I'd argue that that is the most logical place to start, especially as new science comes out and reveals the importance of certain nutrients. Like I mentioned, the choline stuff. A lot of the best research on choline in pregnancy did not exist when I had my first pregnancy. And I can look back and be like, oh man, maybe I would have done things differently. But if you're emphasizing nutrient dense foods, the foods that are rich in iron and zinc and retinol and B12, like, they are also rich in choline usually. So if you're focusing on nutrient dense foods, foods don't just have one nutrient, they really cover your bases. Like, I'd argue that food is a better insurance policy than supplements. I mean, Supplements are meant to supplement what you're eating, not a replacement for.
Totally. My joke is like, the more I learn, the less I know. But the only thing I'm sure of is that we all got to be eating liver. Like, that's just it. Like, because there's just so much conflicting information out there. But liver is our ally.
Certainly, we need some liver, and it's now. I don't know how closely you follow these sorts of things on social media, but everyone went like hog wild on liver for a couple years. Like, I would argue almost overboard. I mean, you have people taking like high potency prenatal, they're eating liver almost daily, and they're taking like desiccated liver and organ supplements. I'm like, whoa, guys, slow your roll here. Like, if you think about this ancestrally, you harvest an animal, you get one set of organs. If you're looking at an animal like a cow, you get hundreds of pounds of meat and you get one liver, which at most, the largest, we do like a cow share from farms typically. The largest liver I've ever gotten was 8 pounds, okay? Relative to hundreds of pounds of meat. So I'm a big fan of liver. I write about it in every single one of my books. I encourage people to consume it, but we're talking like 3 to 6 ounces a week. You don't need to pound liver every single day to get the benefits. It is almost like a multivitamin in its concentration of nutrients. It might not be a 1-for-1 replacement for a prenatal, but it's very, very concentrated in nutrients relative to other foods. So a small little bit fortifies your diet. And most people outside of this like odd situation that occurred in the last couple of years, prior to that, I had never had a client who had overdone liver, because your body doesn't crave it when you don't need it, if you know what I mean. Like you can't overconsume it. You cook up some liver and you're usually going to max out at a few ounces of intake. I will say some people are highly nutrient depleted. They find it delicious and they want to eat like a whole bunch. They probably need it. But for individuals who are fairly nutrient replete, like a few ounces at a time, and they're like, all right, I'm set. I've had my fill on liver. I'll see you like next week or a couple weeks from now,
Yeah, that totally makes sense. It's easy to go overboard if you're in the internet bubble of kind of real food stuff, because it's like, it seems like, well, everybody has their own cows. Everybody,
right.
is eating liver all the time. Everybody. Yeah, it's interesting. But you know what's also interesting? I hear a lot of people kind of use that ancestral argument and say, well, Katie, like we should not be eating so much meat because traditionally people would have a slaughter once or twice a year, and that was lasting a long time, and they weren't eating meat every day, much less at multiple meals. So that is not good. And I say, well, maybe that's the case, maybe not, but also in the current context that we're in, so many of us are so nutritionally depleted from the last several generations that we might have to, like, we can't exactly plug in what was to now.
Yeah. I also think there's differences with your ancestry, where you're from. So I've lived all over the place, including in Alaska, and I can tell you the number of edible plants that you have access to, even during the very short growing season, is extremely limited. I mean, you basically, they do pretty much, at least ancestrally, they would subsist on a borderline ketogenic diet simply because that's all that's available. Like, we weren't always shipping in imports of of grain products and stuff like that. You might dig up some tubers from like the chocolate lily. I mean, I'm very into foraging, so I was into foraging all the things. You might forage a whole bunch of berries. The berries are not sweet. Okay, it's not like eating a raspberry from the grocery store. Crowberries aren't sweet. The wild blueberries are like a little bit sweet. The wild like lingonberries, they would sometimes call them like wild cranberries, or anyways, those were also like, they're very sour. You just don't have access to a whole lot of carbohydrates year round, but particularly during the very long winter when nothing grows. They subsisted on animal foods. So if you're of that ancestry, you probably are pretty well primed to a high animal protein diet. If your ancestry is primarily from the tropics, you probably are primed for a more balanced omnivorous diet because you have fruit growing literally year round. That's just that's just the nature of it. I think as a whole, though, you know, our caloric intake was certainly not what it is nowadays, but our nutrient intake was much higher. Like our nutrients per calorie were so much greater when you're subsisting on local wild foods versus cultivated or shipped or processed foods. So that's certainly one constant. But I think we have to each find our individual sweet spot for our nutrient intake. There are people who thrive with a, you know, greater proportion of carbohydrates and a lower proportion of fat in their diet. There are individuals who thrive on a almost ketogenic diet. I'd say the protein component is probably the one that is like most similar across people. I mean, certainly we have athletes or people who are just much larger, like a 6'6" man needs a lot more protein than a 5' woman, for example. But the protein component, the data is pretty strong that you're going to need probably somewhere like 18 to 20% as a minimum for protein intake to keep your body functioning well, to maintain your lean body mass, to support your metabolism. And the average American is not eating that much. And we're considered to be the population that's always eating too much meat or too much protein. It's like too much protein relative to what? You know, you look at the recommended dietary allowances and they're set at very bare minimum levels. It equates to about 10% of calories from protein. So if you're saying everybody eats too much because their diet has like 12% protein, it's not enough. It's too much compared to the RDA, but the RDA is an arbitrary, very low level set to essentially prevent overt protein deficiency where you die, but not enough to optimize the function of your body. So there's been very, very active debate in the nutrition research world, particularly among protein researchers, arguing that we need to increase our minimum protein requirements much higher than what the RDA suggests. So, you know, everybody can make their own choices, but I think you need to consider more than just, are we meeting the bare minimum government guidelines, and like kind of widen your parameters on what's required.
Yeah, and if you actually put yourself to the task of measuring your protein intake, you'll be surprised, because apparently an egg has, 6 grams of protein. So if you have 2 eggs and a piece of toast for breakfast, that's only 12 grams of protein, which is not a lot. And so I think I read in your book that at the beginning of pregnancy, the goal would be around 80 grams, and then towards the end, it would be 100 grams or maybe even more. And I know that there are some people that say a gram per pound, so an 150-pound woman would be eating 150 grams of protein, which is a massive amount. I'm not sure how someone could do that without supplementing with protein powders. Maybe they're just using extra collagen, or I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, we can get into the weeds on it. So, those numbers are calculated out assuming a woman weighs approximately 150 pounds and based on research specifically done in pregnant women that was identifying what's called an estimated average requirement level for protein. The EAR compared to the RDA, they're different numbers. And EAR is set to meet approximately 50% of the population's protein needs. 50% of people will have their protein needs met when they're consuming that amount. Whereas an RDA is usually set at a higher number. That's designed to meet like 97 to 98% of a population's needs. So if you calculate out an RDA from that number, which that study didn't do, so I'm not going to make up a number and say it's the RDA, it would be higher, which is why how I describe it in the book, this is a minimum level to aim for. So it's very well possible that you may have women who require a lot more than that, but this is minimum. And already that's approximately 40 and over 70% higher than the early and late pregnancy requirements for protein, respectively. So that's already an increase over what the standard is. In Real Food for Fertility, I get into some of the more specifics on protein requirements just in general. Getting all the way up to a gram per pound of body weight, which is 2.2 grams per kilogram. That can be right for some individuals, especially people who are super active. But it kind of depends on, it certainly depends on the person, and it depends on their like body size as well, because, an alternate to doing the gram per pound of body weight concept is a gram per pound of lean body mass. So say you have a client who's like 80 pounds overweight. If you were to give them a gram per pound of actual body weight, that would be a really highly excessive amount of protein. Now, they might not actually get to that level because it'd be so much and protein so satiating that even if you recommend it, it might just not physically be possible. But for that individual, you might calculate it based on lean body mass. But I would say somewhere in the like 1.2 grams per kilogram is a minimum, all the way up to 2.2 grams per kilogram. That would be in the range of protein intake that works for most individuals, aiming just like a little higher in pregnancy, like the 1.2 grams per kilogram may be appropriate for early pregnancy, but late pregnancy, you definitely need to be meeting or exceeding 1.5 grams per kilogram. So, you can calculate it out and get all ridiculously nitpicky. You can also just like aim to have 25, 30 plus grams of protein at every meal, and that'll get you pretty close to optimal. And if you're still hungry, snacks that also have some protein in there, and like call it a day. Don't overcomplicate. Of course, athletes probably need to have it, more dialed in than other people.
Which is totally it. All of this is another reason why we want to focus on preconception nutrition, because some mamas in the first trimester will say, oh my gosh, I couldn't even look at meat. I couldn't even
100%.
And so then it's like, oh no, it's then you have to figure out, okay, can I put collagen in my tea? Can I, how can I add as much protein as possible and actually get it down if there's some foods that I have such an aversion to.
Yeah, and to offer a little bit of reassurance for that time, because those symptoms are so common. They can, of course, be lessened, but I don't know if it's entirely possible to avoid some level of queasiness. Like, I had it in my pregnancies too. Luckily, not super bad. I wasn't like throwing up all the time or anything, but just that sort of like not sure if that's going to sit well. And it's just very touch and go in that time. And a lot of things are just, foods are not appealing. They don't settle well. You just kind of don't feel great. The reassurance I want to offer is that particularly if you have done the preconception work of building your nutrient stores, if you think about technically where your baby is in development, they're still in the embryo phase. They're actually implanted into the uterine wall, and they are being nourished by your endometrium, the lining of your uterus. That's what you shed each menstrual cycle. So assuming you had a sufficient healthy menstrual cycle leading up to conception, you should have a lush, thick, nourished endometrium. There's glands in the endometrium called endometrial glands, and that is actually the source of nourishment for that embryo in the early weeks. So arguably, you're deriving from your preconception nutrient stores during that time to fuel the embryo primarily. It's until the placenta is formed and fully implants, and that happens towards the end of the first trimester into the second trimester. So like 12, 13, 14 weeks. And so there's not like a direct, umbilical cord sending maternal blood to baby back and forth until that happens. Like the placenta, it doesn't really sort of take over in nourishing that growing baby until that stage. So you are relying on your preconception nutrient stores. Of course, we don't want you to become super depleted. And of course, we want to do everything we can to just get as healthy as possible food down the hatch as is feasible for you, pending your symptoms. But don't get too bent out of shape if you're not able to eat really well during that stage. You might not be able to get as much protein down. You might have to rely on alternate protein sources. You said collagen. I remember for me, like dairy products, eggs, if they were scrambled, but not browned, because then it'd smell bad. Beans and legumes, like Mexican food, something that was cooked for me by some other individual, like not myself. Those were all much more tolerable in the first trimester. Smoothies that maybe have protein powder, Greek yogurt, cottage cheese, something like that to get the protein in. That worked well, better than some of my other typical protein options. And then once that phase had passed, I was, back to square one. So just get creative with what you think you can keep down, and just, you have to take it, hour by hour, day by day.
Yes, totally. And yeah, every pregnancy is so unique.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, so I have a couple of questions. One of them is going back to the supplementation. This is kind of just more of like a philosophical question about supplementation, because I have been around quite a bit of people who are, very much into Weston A price and all these things, and a lot of them take vitamin E when they go out to eat, because they say, oh, this vitamin E supplement is going to protect me from PUFAs, protect me from polyunsaturated fats. Maybe I'm exposed to canola oil or corn oil or something when I go out to eat. And, and I've seen these brands, even the good brands, and they're always actually made of the oils that people are supposed to, people are saying that it protects them from, a lot of the vitamin E supplements will be made from soy oil or sunflower oil. And those are exactly the oils that they're trying to avoid when they go out to eat. So I just think it's so interesting, like the way the body could receive the vitamin E. I mean, I guess I'm wondering, does that really work? If I take a vitamin E supplement made in a lab from soy oil, and then I go out to eat to protect myself from soy oil, what am I really doing?
So I think what's happening here is the other the other ingredients in the supplement is probably one of those oils. Whether or not the vitamin E is derived from the soy or the sunflower or whatever, the fact is, like, seeds are our richest source of vitamin E. So I think, like, nature puts vitamin E into seeds to try to protect those very delicate oils from oxidation. So you look at, like, the richest sources of vitamin E, and it's usually seeds, nuts and seeds, and like isolated things from those nuts and seeds, like wheat germ or wheat germ oil is one of the richest sources of vitamin E. In the context of a supplement, they have isolated and concentrated that vitamin E, or maybe they've even made the vitamin E molecule in a lab and put it in a carrier oil that happens to be soy oil or whatever. Whether that's going to offset polyunsaturated fatty acids, I mean, I actually talked about the data on this in Real Food for Fertility. The more polyunsaturated fatty acids you consume, the more oxidative stress your body has, and the quicker you use up your vitamin E stores fighting off that oxidation, all those free radicals. Interestingly, the higher your saturated fat intake is, even if your vitamin E intake is lower, the better your vitamin E status, because your vitamin E stores are not being wasted fighting oxidation because saturated fats don't oxidize. So I think it's an okay strategy if you want to try it. Take your vitamin E before you go in. I think, like, the teeny amount of soy oil that's in the capsule, I mean, you have to think about, like, how many grams of polyunsaturated fats are in there, like maybe 1. And then there's, like, concentrated vitamin E. I don't think that would, like, make the vitamin E no longer effective, but I mean, I totally see your point. It's a little bit ironic that ends up being the carrier oil, because probably some of the vitamin E activity is being degraded just from the polyunsaturated fatty acid content of the carrier oil in the supplement. So it is kind of ironic. It is.
I mean, I almost thought, it's the power of the mind. Like, if I really feel, protected, and I'm like, then
if it lowers your stress, you're probably reducing your oxidative damage. Yeah.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think that if you're calm when you go out to eat because you're not worried about, being exposed to whatever soy, and you take that capsule, I can see that being beneficial.
Yeah, right.
That kind of parallels to the whole Dr. Ray Peat and pro-metabolic space. They are very much anti-fish oils.
Right.
And even anti-cod liver oil. And so it does seem sometimes that there's this, like, battle between Weston A price people and pro-metabolic people. And a lot of that has overlap. But in terms of the fish oil, and specifically even cod liver oil, there does seem to be a little bit of a battle about, like, no, it's all rancid. And then they say, no, not only is it not rancid, you need to take a lot of it. Do you have any thoughts?
I think the answer is somewhere in between.
Yeah.
I think the longer you hang around the nutrition space, and I've been in it for more than 20 years, the more immune, I guess, I get to the dogma and the propaganda that can come from all groups, even those that I might generally mostly agree with. I think a lot of them put out kind of fear-mongering propaganda style content. I'm kind of over it at this point. So at the end of the day, we do need some long chain omega-3 fatty acids directly from our diet or supplements. Like, we cannot manufacture in our body, we don't have the metabolic machinery to manufacture enough EPA and DHA. We cannot elongate omega-3s to that long of a chain. We have to consume them. This is why they're called essential fatty acids. PUFAs actually are also considered essential fatty acids, and they are. It just so happens that there's so much in our diet that you don't need to think about getting enough omega-6 fats. We all get plenty, way more than we need, right? The omega-3 component, because our intake of omega-6 is so high, and that like can kind of take the place in receptor sites for your DHA and EPA, we do need to be diligent about getting enough EPA and DHA. But you don't need massive, massive quantities of EPA and DHA. I mean, it's difficult for me to give a number because there isn't even an official government number. Different organizations have different numbers. They range between the like 250 milligram to like 500 milligram range. Some of them are looking at total omega-3s, including the plant forms. Some of them are just looking at, if you look at that, it's a higher number, a little over a gram. But it's not that much, right? Like 300, 500 micrograms, or milligrams rather, that's like half a gram of fat. 500 milligrams is half a gram of fat. You're not going to be like overloading your body with oxidative stress from half a gram of omega-3 fats. People need to calm down about the crazy. If you're worried, take your vitamin E with it, right? We do need to be really diligent about, if we're supplementing, which sources you're getting, because omega-3s, because they're so delicate and easily damaged by heat, oxidation, light, and all these things, you want to be looking for a company that batch tests every single batch for various levels of oxidative damage, because you don't want to have rancid omega-3 intake. So they're both right and they're both wrong, and the answer is somewhere in between. We do need some dietary source of these omega-3 fatty acids, but I've seen people get so bent out of shape out of this that they're recommending people avoid salmon. I'm like, oh my gosh, we've gone so far down the PUFAs are bad train that we now have people fearing eating fish. I mean, the fish would arguably be the best source when the fat is still within like a whole food matrix. That's when it's least likely to be oxidized. It's most likely to be oxidized when you've extracted it from something and processed it, right? So like, we're getting so crazy about PUFAs that people aren't eating salmon. Like, give me a break. Like, oh my gosh.
Yeah. Yes, totally. I mean, all of this it's just, Instagram has changed so much because now,
Yes,
you know, one person says something and then 20 people say it, and then it's like, oh, it's common knowledge. It is interesting though, because back to kind of the folic acid thing that we spoke about at the beginning, you know, I've heard all kinds of people say, oh, you know, folic acid accumulates in the body and it blocks receptors of folate. And then I've heard you speak about, well, actually, there's not so much data. There's really not enough data to definitively say exactly what's happening with accumulated folic acid, or where, I don't even understand really where it accumulates exactly. So, but I guess what I'm trying to say is it's very easy for people to just repeat, and like 30 people say it on Instagram, and then all of a sudden it's like, well, yeah, don't you know, it's common knowledge that folic acid accumulates and blocks receptors of folate, and this is what happens, and it causes this, and it's connected with this, and it's just, so yeah, I do appreciate her.
Yeah. Social media gets a little wild. So the folic acid thing, to clear it up, and I believe this is covered in my article. If it's not, it's covered in my webinar on folate and methylation as it relates to fertility and pregnancy over on the Women's Health Nutrition Academy website. We do have data that folic acid does accumulate. It's not all of it is processed. Your body can process about 200 to 280 micrograms of folic acid per day. Beyond that intake, you start seeing a rise in folic acid that hasn't been metabolized. They literally call it unmetabolized folic acid, or UMFA. You can look up in the medical literature UMFA and you'll find it. And we don't really know what it does in the body. It certainly accumulates in the bloodstream, but we don't know the full effects. There are all sorts of theories out there, but none of them have really been tested super adequately. So a really common one that you'll see come up on social media, I even did a research brief on it, is people saying that folic acid will cause tongue ties. You have to be really, really, really careful with the word cause. We don't know for sure if that's the case. We have like one study, the one that I write about in that research brief, I think it's also my folate article, where there was a connection. Those who had, higher intakes of folic acid, there was a higher rate of tongue ties in their children, but it's a fairly small study and it's observational in nature. It's not like one where they've tested causality, where we have like a randomized controlled trial and you take two groups and one has folic acid and one doesn't. That would even be a really hard study to do because the average person is taking in like 300 micrograms of folic acid from fortified foods every day anyways. So it'd be really like you'd have to give people a diet with no processed foods, which would confound the study, right? You know how complicated this stuff gets. So yeah, there's all sorts of theories out there. I don't know that they've all been they certainly haven't all been proven, otherwise I'd be writing about them. But social media itself, it creates a bit of a tricky situation. Like, I don't know if you've seen all the controversial content now going around about liver. So now all these people who used to be, these are former pro-metabolic eaters, saying that liver intake really of like any amount is going to cause vitamin A overload and copper toxicity. This was the same group that less than a year ago was every other post was about everyone's getting too much iron and not enough copper and promoting a high retinol intake. These are just themes that I see recurring over and over again, year after year in the nutrition space. I kind of don't pay all that much attention to it. But people bring it to my attention because then I'm the one who kind of has to like level set and calm everybody down from their panic caused by these posts.
Right, because it really is not as complicated as we,
No, it's not.
Let me eat real food. Let me make sure I'm eating regularly enough. Let me make sure I'm having some broth, some organ meat once in a while, some good veggies. Let me make sure I'm happy when I eat. Let me make sure that I'm having some seafood. Let me, it's not, let me make sure I'm, soaking my beans and eating good beans like my grandmother did. It's not super, it doesn't have to be super complicated.
Yeah, you can pick a couple things to work on at a time. None of us made changes overnight, but back when I was first introduced to any of this stuff, I was eating like a vegetarian diet. It took me like 3 years to get comfortable consuming an adequate amount of fat. It took me another, I don't know, 5-10 years to finally like dial in, oh wow, I need a lot more protein than I thought I did, and like I thrive at this level of macronutrients. All of it is fine-tuning. You're fine-tuning at different life stages. You're adjusting to the weird symptoms that pregnancy throws your way. And every step of the way, if you just think of prioritizing your like nutrient intake, but also your, like, as you mentioned, enjoying what you eat, your mental well-being, cooking things that make you happy, making your food taste good, So it's not this like miserable chore having to cook and eat, you know, like bring some enjoyment into your life. We don't need to like hyper stress about all of these little details or spend an arm and a leg on all the supplements that like every influencer is hawking a new supplement every other week, you know. Most of those are not going to end up being the silver bullet to your health woes. Your health is built on a foundation of like daily practices. Are you eating enough food? Are you eating breakfast? Are you eating enough protein? Are you including like a wide variety of foods? Because like the wider the variety, the greater chance you're going to hit your micronutrient requirements. Are you going to sleep at a decent hour? Are you living a lifestyle that you can like mitigate whatever stressors come your way? Are you moving your body? These are all like this is the foundation. Some of these extra things are just like bonus and optimizing. But a lot of people skip the foundation and go straight to these, you know, expensive supplements or these complicated protocols or counting every single morsel of food. And that's just beyond what most people need to be doing. And I would argue often works against them in the long run.
So if somebody is doing all of those, all like covering the foundations, covering, you know, I'm eating well, I'm enjoying life, I'm moving my body, etc., and I'm still having some problems. I have met some people who, you know, it does come in waves, right? But recently I've been around people and the whole heavy metals thing is back. Like, okay, maybe my issues are having to do with heavy metals, and I'm wondering what your thoughts are with people who do want to conceive and still have mercury fillings in their mouth. I've heard different perspectives. I've heard the perspective of only touch them if you have a really good reason to. I've heard the perspective like it's better to leave them in there no matter what, because even if you do it really well with a biological dentist, there still is going to be some disruption, and you would want to space that out like 2 years from conception, you know. And then we know regular dentists probably are like, what are you even talking about? It doesn't matter. So do you have any thoughts specifically on mercury fillings and in relation to conception and pregnancy?
Yeah, so I mean, I don't know if I have perfect answers to all of your questions because when I'm giving an answer to something, especially when it's like a very specific, like, you know, oh, this time range or to do this intervention or not do this intervention, I usually like to have some data to answer those questions. I don't know if we have that data. I mean, I write about mercury and specifically from amalgams too, and both Real Food for Fertility and Real Food for Pregnancy. I don't know that I've seen the data on like, you know, the mercury load in individuals who like have the amalgams and then in individuals who've had them removed at different time points to tell you when the mercury exposure has lessened, when you've like detoxified, all of that to be like quote unquote safe for conception. I haven't seen that data, so I can't really say exactly what time frame is going to be right for people or whether removal is the right choice. I guess I would say, you know, if you're in like a 6-month window of trying to conceive, that's probably not a good time to get the amalgams out because there is going to be a period of time of higher exposure and you have to go pretty heavy on the chelation and detoxification protocols. And hopefully if you're even considering doing it and your biological dentist doesn't have a plan for that, and you don't also have like a functional medicine team that's like helping you determine how to do it, I wouldn't go into it blind. Like I would feel like maybe it's better to leave them than to remove them. That said, if you have like notable health issues that seem to be tied to your mercury burden, maybe the right choice is to delay conception, get them taken out, sort of remediate the mercury scenario until your health improves. I think you'd probably have to take it on a case-by-case basis for that. I mean, at the end of the day, you can't get them removed in pregnancy. You wouldn't want to get them removed while breastfeeding because mercury transfers into breast milk. And then are you going to have more children? It's just like, when is the time, if ever? It's challenging. I mean, at the end of the day, in an ideal world, like we would have just prevented putting them in the first place. You know, we wouldn't be in this crazy scenario where so many people have metal in their mouth that's, you know, slowly releasing mercury into their system. But what to do about it is really, really tricky. And that's you know, talk about access to things. And especially in other countries where, like, I think in the US, there's more dentists who are willing to do alternative fillings other than amalgam that have a lower heavy metal burden. But you go to other countries and that's it. You get a filling and it's amalgam. So you have people that their whole mouth is metal. I mean, what do you do? I don't know. Possibly having some things on board like chlorella to help bind can be helpful. Even that gets controversial because people are concerned that you're going to be like pulling more out. I don't know that I have a perfect answer to that as well. So you might have to just consult somebody other than a YouTube interview on the internet.
Oh yeah, totally. I don't
nutrition professional versus a mercury professional on where to go about that. Yeah.
Oh yeah, I definitely don't expect anybody to listen to this and to have the answers. Just kind of like,
yeah, of course.
Yeah, a hint on what their next step is for sure.
Yeah.
I did hear a midwife recently say, just the other day, she said, "Oh, you know, women can definitely eat seafood during pregnancy unless they have amalgam fillings, and then they shouldn't." And I was like, "Did you make that up, or is there
That's made up? That's
I
made
know,
up.
but it's just so tricky. It's a tricky world because when someone in a position of authority, you know, makes something up but says it with conviction, then it's like, wow, it's so, you know, you really feel, oh wow, okay, I can't, you know.
Yeah, there's been some interesting stuff on seafood come out. I actually wrote an article for my blog fairly recently on fish and pregnancy, going through fairly large systematic review on fish and seafood intake and mercury exposure and brain development in children. And essentially they were trying to see, can we find like an upper limit for seafood that's harmful, overtly harmful to neurodevelopment? Because with the seafood, you have this like double-edged sword. You have like the mercury, environmental contaminants or whatever. And then you have, it's really highly nutrient dense. You have the omega-3s, the DHA, the iodine, the selenium, the B12, the vitamin A, the iron, zinc, copper, all the things. And so like, we know fish generally is beneficial to neurodevelopment as well as those nutrients, but we know that mercury is a neurotoxin. So like, where is this middle ground? And they actually were not able to identify a level at which seafood intake was harmful to neurodevelopment. They even stratified their analysis by like fatty and oily fish, which like tuna falls into that category. Many of these fish are much larger. They have more mercury. They also have more selenium though, which helps offset the mercury exposure. And again, they were not able to find a difference or any sort of problem from like the oily fish scenario. So, I mean, I've long been of the recommendation. It's actually ironically in line with the FDA, which is that 12 ounces of seafood a week is beneficial. Prioritizing high omega-3 seafood. I think it's wise to like not make all of your seafood high mercury, of course. Like I also think it's wise to like for tuna specifically, since it is so high in mercury, at least some types of tuna, to, you know, not have every single meal of fish be tuna. But I'm now of the opinion that like, well, I don't think you need to be worried if you're eating more than 12 ounces of seafood per week. Even in the women whose mercury levels were higher because of seafood intake, that was not associated with neurodevelopmental issues, but higher mercury levels from other sources, say amalgam probably falls into that category, was associated with neurodevelopmental challenges. So the source of the mercury actually matters. And I think with seafood, because you're getting it in most types of seafood concomitantly with that selenium, which helps reduce the mercury toxicity and how much is retained in your system, it doesn't seem to have, you know, as many, you know, potential downsides. So, you know, big fan of fish and seafood for pregnancy. I don't know where that concept of avoiding fish based on whether or not you have amalgams come from. Probably made up. A lot of people just make up stuff. But that certainly I've never seen any studies suggesting even looking into that link. So
Okay, well, that is why we are so grateful for your books and your work and your blog posts, which are incredible. My dream would be to have all of that translated into Spanish. So like,
yeah.
that would be super epic because I just feel like it's, oh gosh, it's just so important. I mean, really what we're talking about is the future of humanity, you know?
Healthy moms, healthy babies, next healthy generation. Yeah.
No, it's just, it's so important. And I'm really grateful for your work. The house that I'm currently renting, the mom is vegetarian and very much speaks about the diet as though it were kind of a superior diet, and her daughter is 20, and I'm like, daughter, listen to me. You know, I want to be like, listen, your mama is wrong because
right.
because she's only 20, and I'm like, oh man, you are only 20. We could really, you know, now's the time to be really thinking about optimizing your physiology so that one day you can have these really beautiful, not only healthy babies, but that you come out of the other side of birth and breastfeeding and you're not completely collapsed.
Yeah, for sure. In full agreement with you there.
Yeah.
Yeah, you know, in Real Food for Pregnancy, I have a little section at the end of the nutrient dense foods chapter on some of the challenges of a vegetarian diet. And that one's really focused primarily on some of the major micronutrients of concern. It does also have tips to optimize a vegetarian diet for those who choose to continue. But in Real Food for Fertility, we decided to put in actually a whole chapter on the vegetarian diet and its potential impacts on fertility. And we go beyond just the micronutrient conversation. I get a little more into the weeds on the macronutrient balance, fatty acid ratios, amino acids of concern. They're just the amount of research that has commenced about amino acids that we used to think are non-essential, and how important they are to optimizing our health. There's a lot of information on that. And in addition, I include a section on, for those who are looking to leave a vegetarian diet and incorporate animal foods again, how to go about doing that, what to prioritize. because there's all different reasons that people choose to eat in a certain way. I'm not here to say whether those reasons are valid or invalid or right or wrong or whatever, but to like honor where the person's at and give them options. Like, okay, like there's tips to optimize for those individuals who want to continue. For those who want to transition off of a vegetarian diet, what was your reason for doing it in the first place, and where do you go next? Like, which foods do you think you want to introduce first? And there's all sorts of different, like, there's no right or wrong way to do it. I just kind of like hold your hand a little bit through that process, because that has been, you know, a lot of my writing is a response to what my audience is asking me for. What questions are they asking me? And I'm trying to like answer that on a broad scale, because I can't take on everybody and I can't have individual conversations with every single person. So this was like a resource that people had asked me for, like, how do I transition off? So that's all in there if people want to take a look at that. And I don't know if that, you know, person that you're living with, her daughter, would be interested in reading that. But there may be some, you know, some aha moments in there for her.
Yeah, for sure. Totally. So Lily, thank you so much. I'm going to put your website in the description. I'm going to put your Instagram in the description. I'll put your books as well. I'll link your books, especially the new book, Real Food for Fertility. And I want to give you the chance to say anything, kind of a closing thought before we part ways. I'm so grateful for your work. It's so, so important. I mean, you really filled a niche that nobody else decided to fill. And it's just such an important one for humanity.
Yeah, well, I'm happy to, this is my life's work, so I can't not do it, right? Despite the insane amount of work it is to research and write and edit and put together books. So yeah, you can find me on my website, lilynicholsrdn.com. I link out to my books on there, my blog's up there. And yeah, thanks for having me on.
Thank you so much. And thank you to everybody listening. I hope that this interview was inspiring and helpful. And let's go eat some good food.